When the gods finally came to save Beleriand, they destroyed it. 42 years of war. An army assembled in paradise, the mightiest host ever to walk the earth. And when the last dragon fell from the sky and the last tower crumbled, the land itself broke apart and sank beneath the sea. Every kingdom the elves had built, every forest where they sang, every battlefield where they bled for 600 years, fighting an enemy they could never defeat alone. Gone, drowned, as if it had never been. This is the story of the War of Wrath, the greatest victory in the history of Middle-earth and the most devastating price ever paid for one. For nearly 600 years, the elves and men of Beleriand fought Morgoth alone. They built kingdoms and watched them fall. Nargothrond, that magnificent underground fortress carved by Finrod Felagund, overrun by Glaurung and his orc legions. Gondolin, the hidden city, the crown jewel of elvish civilization, betrayed from within and burned to ash. The union of Maedhros, the greatest alliance ever forged against the Dark Lord, shattered in a single catastrophic afternoon at the Nirnaeth Arnoediad, the battle of unnumbered tears. 600 years of defiance, of courage, of what Tolkien called northern courage, the willingness to fight an enemy you cannot defeat simply because the fight matters. And through all of it, the Valar watched from the Blessed Realm and did nothing. It is easy to read that silence as indifference, but the truth is more complicated and more troubling. The Valar had intervened before. Long ages earlier, when Morgoth first claimed dominion over Middle-earth and the newly awakened elves lay defenseless, the Valar waged the War of the Powers, and won. They dragged Morgoth back to Valinor in the chain Angainor and imprisoned him for 3 ages. But the cost was staggering. The war reshaped the geography of Arda itself. Continents cracked, seas shifted, the original symmetry of the world was broken beyond repair. The Valar learned a lesson that would haunt them for the rest of recorded history. When beings of supreme might clash within a fragile world, the world breaks. So they waited. Not out of cruelty, but out of a genuine moral paralysis. To intervene meant devastation on a continental scale. To abstain meant watching their beloved children suffer and die, age after age, under the grinding tyranny of the enemy. It was a dilemma without a clean answer. And Tolkien, a man who had survived the Somme and understood something about the gap between strategic necessity and human agony, never pretended there was one. By the year 532 of the First Age, the question had become academic. The sons of Feanor, driven by their terrible oath, attacked the last refuge of elves and men at the havens of Sirion. In the chaos, Elwing, granddaughter of Beren and Luthien, keeper of the Silmaril they had torn from Morgoth's crown, threw herself into the sea rather than surrender the jewel. And from that act of desperation came the only thing that could break the Valar's paralysis. Ulmo, Lord of Waters, transformed Elwing into a great white bird, and she flew across the ocean bearing the Silmaril to her husband Eärendil, who waited aboard his ship Vingilot. Together, with the holy jewel blazing on Eärendil's brow, they attempted what no mortal had ever done. They sailed west, through the shadowy seas and the enchanted isles, past every barrier the Valar had raised to keep the realm of men from touching the realm of the gods. And they succeeded, not because the ship was extraordinary or because Eärendil was the greatest mariner who ever lived, though both were true. They succeeded because Eärendil was something that had never existed before, a bridge between 2 worlds. Son of Tuor, a mortal man, and Idril, an immortal elf. half-elven, carrying on his brow a jewel that held the light of the two trees, the last unsullied fragment of the world before Morgoth's corruption. He was the intersection of every lineage, every grief, every hope. When he stepped onto the shores of Valinor, the elves who dwelt there greeted him with words Tolkien clearly intended to echo the Gospels. Hail Eärendil, of mariners most renowned, the looked-for that cometh at unawares, the longed-for that cometh beyond hope. Eärendil stood before the Valar and pleaded, not for the elves alone, not for men alone, for both, for all the children of Ilúvatar who suffered under Morgoth's tyranny. He accepted the burden of the Noldor's ancient crimes, even though he bore no guilt himself, and he asked for mercy. The Valar were moved. After centuries of calculated restraint, after weighing and re-weighing the terrible arithmetic of intervention, they chose to act. They assembled the greatest host that Arda had ever seen or would ever see again. But the decision came with a cost for Eärendil himself. Because he carried mortal blood into the Blessed Realm, a judgment had to be rendered. The Valar gave Eärendil and Eönwë a choice: be counted among elves or among men. Both chose elvenkind. But Eärendil would never return to Middle-earth as a person. He would sail the sky forever aboard Vingilot, the Silmaril on his brow becoming the star Gil Estel, the star of high hope, visible from every corner of Arda. The mediator who bridged two worlds was now exiled from both. The price of saving everyone was losing everything. Even the Teleri, the elves of the shore, whose kin had been slaughtered by the Noldor at Alqualonde in the first kinslaying, agreed to help. They would not fight. The memory of their murdered families was too raw for that, but they would sail the ships that carried the Host of Valinor across the sea. Not for the Noldor's sake, for Eönwë's, who was kin to them through Lúthien's line. Forgiveness is not always total. Sometimes it is a hand extended just far enough to help, while still keeping its distance. There is a deliberate echo of Norse mythology in all of this, one that Tolkien, a scholar of Old English and Old Norse, would have recognized immediately. The gods of Asgard ride out for Ragnarok, knowing the world will end. The Valar rode out knowing Beleriand would break. But where Ragnarok offers only destruction and a tentative rebirth, Tolkien, rooted in Catholic theology, inflected the pattern with something the Norse myths lack: a mediator. Eärendil, the half-mortal bearing hallowed light, is not a warrior god riding to inevitable doom. He is an intercessor, a figure closer to prayer than to battle. And that distinction matters because it changes the meaning of everything that follows. The army that landed on the shores of Beleriand was unlike anything Middle-earth had witnessed. Eönwë, herald and banner-bearer of Manwë, led the host in the field, described as the mightiest in arms of all in Arda. Beside him marched the Vanyar, the fairest of the elvish kindred, who had never once left the Blessed Realm in all the ages of the world. This was their single departure, their only war, and they would return to Valinor the moment it was over, and never leave again. Whether the Valar themselves, Tulkas the wrestler, Orome the hunter, took physical form and fought alongside their armies is a question Tolkien never clearly answered. In his later writings, he stepped back from the early mythology's cosmic battle scenes. Scholars have noted that he never stated in any post-Lord of the Rings writing whether any of the Valar participated directly. The ambiguity seems deliberate. Tolkien was increasingly uncomfortable with gods engaging in physical combat. It clashed with the theological framework he was developing, where the Valar functioned more as archangels than as Norse war gods. What we do know is that the war lasted approximately 42 years. That number is worth pausing over. This was not a single glorious battle. It was a grinding, decades-long campaign across the length and breadth of Beleriand. The host of Valinor fought orcs in their countless thousands, balrogs wielding flame and shadow, great wolves, corrupted men who had sworn allegiance to Morgoth, and creatures whose names were never recorded. The published Silmarillion condenses this entire 42-year conflict into a handful of paragraphs. Christopher Tolkien later acknowledged that the chapter was one of the most editorially constructed in the book. His father had never written a fully developed account consistent with his later mythology. The only complete version Tolkien finished was the Quenta Eönwë of 1930, which reflected an early mythology at odds with his mature thinking. Christopher called the published text a quick exit rather than further fabrication, deliberately brief rather than speculatively elaborate. And here lies one of the strangest ironies in all of Tolkien's work. The largest, most consequential military engagement in the history of Arda, the battle that ended a Dark Lord's reign, sank a continent, and reshaped the very land, received less narrative attention from its creator than the fall of a single hidden city or the duel between one elf king and one balrog. Why? The answer probably has several layers. The war's scale exceeded what prose narrative could convincingly portray without descending into spectacle. Neither elves nor men would have had reliable records of such chaos. The mythic quality of the story demanded the compression of legend rather than the sprawl of history. And Tolkien, who was 73 when he died, simply ran out of time. The result is that the War of Wrath exists in the legendarium as something half-glimpsed, enormous in consequence, fragmentary in detail, carrying the weight of a story that was never fully told. And that, paradoxically, may be what makes it so powerful. What we imagine in the gaps is vaster than anything a page could hold. One detail that does survive in the later texts deserves attention: the balrogs. Early versions of the mythology featured them in hundreds or thousands, vast hosts of flame-wielding demons. But in a late marginal note, Tolkien reduced their total number to, at most, 7. If that revision holds, then the War of Wrath destroyed most of the balrogs who ever existed. Only a handful escaped, hiding in the deepest roots of the mountains. One of them, Durin's Bane, would sleep beneath Moria for more than 5,000 years before a company of dwarves dug too deep and woke it. The war's consequences, it turns out, were still echoing in the Third Age. The armies of the Valar were winning. Year by year, Morgoth's forces were driven back. His orcs were slaughtered, his balrogs fell. The plains of Anfauglith, already a desert of ash from the Near Naiath, became a graveyard for the forces of darkness. The fortress of Angband, seat of Morgoth's power for the entire First Age, was under siege. And then, when defeat seemed certain, Morgoth played his final card. From the pits of Angband erupted winged dragons, creatures that had never before been seen in Middle-earth. At their head flew Ancalagon the Black, the greatest of all dragon kind, a being of such raw, destructive magnitude that Gandalf would reference him thousands of years later as the ultimate benchmark of devastation. The Silmarillion describes their assault in elemental language: great thunder and lightning and a tempest of fire. The army of the Blessed Realm was driven back. Let that register. An army assembled by the gods themselves, led by the greatest warrior in all of Arda, reinforced by angelic beings and immortal elves who had lived in the light of paradise. This army retreated before the dragons. For a terrible span of time, it appeared that Morgoth's gambit would succeed, that even divine intervention was not enough. This is the moment Tolkien was building toward, not just in this chapter, but across the entire Silmarillion. He had a word for it: eucatastrophe. The sudden, joyous turn in a story that seems headed for catastrophe. Not a deus ex machina, the rescue is prepared, earned, seeded throughout the narrative. But it arrives at the moment of deepest despair, piercing hopelessness, with unexpected grace. Before the rising of the sun, Eärendil descended from the sky, not as a mariner anymore, but as a star made flesh, Vingilot blazing with the light of the Silmaril, flanked by Thorondor and the great eagles. And in the darkness above Thangorodrim, an aerial battle unfolded that would never be equaled in the history of Arda. All through the night they fought, eagles against dragons, the light of the hallowed jewel against the fire of Morgoth's final weapons. And at its end, Eärendil slew Ancalagon the Black and cast him from the sky. Ancalagon fell upon the towers of Thangorodrim, those three great volcanic peaks that had loomed over Beleriand for the entire age, and they were broken in his ruin. The mountains that symbolized Morgoth's dominion were destroyed not by the army of the gods, but by the falling body of his own greatest weapon. There is something almost unbearably Tolkienian about that image, the instrument of tyranny destroying the monument to tyranny. The weapon turned against its maker not by cunning or strategy, but by the sheer consequence of its own defeat. Scholar John Garth has noted that internet debates about Ancalagon's precise physical dimensions miss the point entirely. Tolkien wrote in a medieval legendary mode where scale communicates significance rather than measurement. Ancalagon is as large as he needs to be to break 3 mountains. Eärendil's victory is as miraculous as it needs to be to constitute a catastrophe. The precision is emotional, not empirical. With Thangorodrim shattered and his dragons slain, Morgoth had nothing left. The being who had once been Melkor, first among the Ainur, the one to whom Ilúvatar had given the greatest gifts, cowered in the deepest mine of Angband. He sued for peace. But the time for mercy was past. The Valar's host dragged him out. They hewed his feet from under him. They bound him in Angainor, the same chain forged by Aule that had held him once before, ages ago. And then they took his iron crown, the one he had worn since stealing the Silmarils, and they beat it into a collar for his neck. His head was bowed upon his knees. The Dark Lord of the First Age ended as he had lived, diminished, trapped in a body that had become his prison, stripped of almost everything that had once made him the most powerful being in Arda. By this point, as Tolkien's late philosophical writings make clear, Morgoth had poured so much of his original strength into the substance of Arda that he was a shadow of the mightiest Valar. He alone of the Ainur knew fear, because he alone had permanently bound himself to a physical form. The being the Valar dragged from Angband was monstrous and hobbled, a creature of spite rather than grandeur. They thrust him through the door of night, beyond the walls of the world, into the timeless void. Whether he would ever return became the great unanswered question of Tolkien's mythology. An early text, the second prophecy of Maedhros, foretold a last battle, the Dagor Dagorath, in which Morgoth would break back through the door and be slain by Turin Turambar. But Tolkien later questioned this prophecy, and Christopher Tolkien removed it from the published Silmarillion. The question remains open, and deliberately so. 2 Silmarils remained in that ruined crown. The third sailed the sky on Eärendil's brow. And here, at the moment that should have been pure triumph, the First Age's most persistent tragedy reasserted itself. Maedhros and Maglor, the last surviving sons of Feanor, the only 2 of 7 brothers still alive after centuries of war, kinslaying, and self-destruction, claimed the Silmarils. Their oath demanded it. They had sworn before Ilúvatar himself to pursue anyone who kept a Silmaril from them, and not even the army of the Valar could make them abandon that vow. Eönwë let them take the jewels. He could have stopped them, supreme in arms of all in Arda, but he recognized that the oath had a force beyond military strength. It was metaphysical, unbreakable by any hand but the one that swore it. And the Silmarils burned them. The hallowed jewels, which had been fashioned by their own father's hands, rejected Maedhros and Maglor as unworthy. The brothers had committed too many crimes in the jewel's name. 3 kinslayings, the blood of their own people on their hands, and the light of the 2 trees would not suffer their touch. Maedhros, the elder, could not bear it. He cast himself into a fiery chasm, the Silmaril clutched to his chest, and both were consumed by the earth. Maglor, the singer, threw his jewel into the sea, and then he walked the shores of Middle-earth, singing in pain and regret. Some say he wanders still. And thus it came to pass that the Silmarils found their long homes, one in the airs of heaven, and one in the fires of the heart of the world, and one in the deep waters. Sky, earth, and sea, the 3 jewels that had driven an entire age of bloodshed, returned to the elements. 1 redeemed as a star of hope, 2 lost to grief and remorse. The oath of Feanor was fulfilled in the cruelest way possible. Every Silmaril recovered, but none could be kept. The doom of Mandos, that ancient curse pronounced upon the Noldor when they left Valinor in defiance, was finally spent. In the wreckage of Morgoth's empire, one figure appeared before Eönwë, who would prove more consequential than Ancalagon, more dangerous than every Balrog combined, more enduring than Morgoth himself. Sauron. Morgoth's chief lieutenant, the most skilled of his servants, came forward in fair form and abjured all his evil deeds. He knelt before the herald of Manwë and declared his repentance. And here is the detail that Tolkien found most fascinating, the one he returned to repeatedly in his letters and notes. This repentance may have been real. Not noble, not born of moral awakening, but genuine in its way. Tolkien wrote that, "Some hold that this was not at first falsely done, but that Sauron in truth repented, if only out of fear. He had seen his master dragged from the ruins of Angband with his feet cut off and his crown hammered into a collar. Sauron was terrified, and terror, occasionally, opens a door that pride keeps shut. Eönwë commanded him to return to Aman and face judgment. A straightforward demand. Go home, accept the consequences of your choices, begin again. Sauron refused, not dramatically, not with defiance or fire. He simply could not bear the humiliation. Tolkien's phrasing is precise and devastating. Then Sauron was ashamed, and he was unwilling to return in humiliation and to receive from the Valar a sentence, it might be, of long servitude in proof of his good faith. Shame. Not evil, not ambition, shame. The Maiar who could have walked back into grace chose to hide in Middle-earth rather than face judgment. And from that single act of pride, from that refusal to endure the embarrassment of accountability, everything that followed in the Second and Third Ages was born. Tolkien elaborated in Letter 131, describing how Sauron began, with fair motives, the reorganizing and rehabilitation of the ruin of Middle-earth, neglected by the gods. He wanted to fix things, to impose order on the chaos left behind. But without humility, without submission to any authority beyond himself, those fair motives curdled into tyranny. He became, in Tolkien's words, a reincarnation of evil and a thing lusting for complete power. And he learned from his master's mistakes. Where Morgoth had dispersed his native essence into the very matter of ardor, weakening himself while corrupting the world, Sauron concentrated his into a single artifact. One ring. All his cruelty, his malice, his will to dominate the free peoples of Middle-earth poured into a band of gold. A different strategy for a different age, but the same hunger at its root. When the fighting stopped and the dust and fire settled, the victors surveyed what they had saved. It was gone. Nearly all of it. Beleriand, the vast northwestern region where every great elvish kingdom had risen and fallen, where Beren met Luthien, where Turin fought his doomed war, where Fingolfin rode alone to challenge a god, lay shattered and sinking. The violence of the conflict had been too much for the land to bear. When powers of the magnitude of the Valar and their opponents clash within a physical realm, the physics of that realm surrender. Hills were ripped up, mountains split, great rifts opened in the earth, and the sea rushed in to claim what remained. Most of the dry land west of the Blue Mountains vanished beneath the ocean. The Blue Mountains themselves cracked at their center, creating the Gulf of Lune. What had been a continent became a coastline. But fragments survived, and Tolkien, who understood that memory lives in landscape, made those fragments matter. Tol Morwen, a tiny island in empty ocean that had once been part of the forest of Brethil, preserved the graves of Turin Turambar and his mother Morwen. A prophecy fulfilled, a monument no one would visit, standing in water where trees once grew. Tol Himling, the highland where Maedhros had built his fortress, now a lonely rock surrounded by nothing. And Lindon, a remnant of old Osiriand, pressed against the eastern face of the broken Blue Mountains, which became the last elven kingdom in Middle-earth, and eventually the site of the Grey Havens, from which the elves would depart for thousands of years to come. Geography as grief. The map itself became a record of loss. The Valar's dilemma from the beginning of our story, the knowledge that supreme force acting within a fragile world inevitably shatters that world, had been vindicated in the worst possible way. They saved the elves and men of Beleriand, they ended Morgoth's reign, and they destroyed the homeland in the process. It was the right choice. It was an agonizing one. But the deepest truth of the War of Wrath lies beneath even the drowned geography. In Tolkien's late philosophical writings, collected in the volume Morgoth's Ring, he developed a concept that transforms the entire meaning of this conflict. Just as Sauron would later pour his power into the One Ring, Morgoth, over thousands of years, had dispersed his native Valar power into the very substance of Arda. The iron, the stone, the water, the air. He had poured himself into the world, not metaphorically, literally. This means that the world itself was Morgoth's ring. His corruption could not be separated from the material of creation without unmaking creation entirely. The marring was permanent. Tolkien wrote that it could not be wholly undone, not even by Melkor repentant, for power had gone forth from him and could not be recalled. So the victors captured a body. They imprisoned a diminished spirit behind the door of night. But the enemy's true legacy was the damaged creation they all still inhabited. Arda marred, the broken earth, permanently stained by the will of its greatest corrupter. Evil had become structural, woven into the fabric of physical reality, and no army, however divine, could cut it out. The Silmarillion ends with words that carry the full weight of this understanding. Here ends the Silmarillion, and if it has passed from the high and the beautiful to darkness and ruin, that was of old the fate of Arda marred. And if any change shall come, and the marring be amended, Manwë and Vardë may know. But they have not revealed it, and it is not declared in the dooms of Mandos. Victory. Absolute, total, military victory over the greatest evil Arda had ever known. And the world was still broken, would always be broken. That is the War of Wrath. Not a simple triumph, not a clean ending, a eucatastrophe in the truest sense. Joy and sorrow so intertwined that separating them would destroy the meaning of both. The courage of those who fought without hope for 600 years was vindicated. The light of the Silmarils found its way home. The Dark Lord was cast into the outer darkness. And Beleriand, beautiful Beleriand, sank beneath the waves, and a new shadow was already forming in the east, where a lieutenant too proud to kneel was beginning to dream of rings. The courage was not wasted. 600 years of hopeless resistance, Every doomed stand, every fallen kingdom, every battle fought knowing it could not be won, preserved the remnant until help arrived. That is the quiet miracle beneath the spectacle. Not the dragons or the sinking continent, but the stubbornness of those who refuse to stop fighting simply because victory was impossible. Tolkien understood that some victories break the world they save, and he believed they were worth it anyway. If this journey into the First Age's final reckoning moved you, subscribe to Ranger of the Realms for more explorations of Tolkien's deepest lore. Let me know in the comments, do you think Morgoth will ever return through the Door of Night? May you find courage that outlasts the darkness.